The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to this August edition of the Virtual Roundtable with Idaho Commerce. Today we have Whelan from the Nature Conservancy to talk about collaborative forest restoration in the state of Idaho. I guess the only other thing I have to say before we Will get started is please type up your questions as you have them, and he will get to them as they come up. And with that, I will hand it over to Will to get started.
All right. Welcome, folks. We are a small group on an August afternoon. And so in thinking about this, I decided to be super informal.
Perfect.
So I just put these slides together this morning. I'm going to talk through them, and I'm going to invite folks to really step up with questions during this. There's few enough of us so that I think it'd be enjoyable to hear from you, I guess, to see your questions as we go through this. So I'm Will Whelan. My day job is that I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Nature Conservancy in Idaho. In that capacity, I serve on a group called the Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership. And so this talk is going to be about the work of the partnership as well as some of the work that the Nature Conservancy is doing. And it's going to be about collaborative forest restoration. I've planned a pretty ambitious hour here. I hope to go deep with you on basically a bunch of stuff about the future of our national forests. And kind of the core question that we're going to talk about through this is why a conservation group like the Nature Conservancy would be in favor of increasing logging on national forests. Now, I'll give you a hint about the answer. It'll be a lot about why, where, and what else is going along with it. But I really, I'm fascinated by national forests. I think a lot of Idahoans are. National forests are close to 40% of our state. If you look at pictures of Idaho and how we talk about our state, often what we're talking about is national forest lands are our most scenic and where we go to recreate. They've also have a large number of ecological challenges, economic issues in timber-dependent communities. And a big part of this talk is to try to explore with you all what might become a basis for timber management in national forests that is broadly supported and has some economic benefits. So before I get going, I've got to get the screen go live here. I wanted to acknowledge these folks. I did what a lot of presenters do. I cobbled together a bunch of slides from different slideshows. Perfect. And they wound up being a whole bunch of people. So these are them. You'll see lots of different formats, lots of different stuff going on. But here is the scheme of the talk. I'll start by talking about collaborative groups that are working for national forest restoration in Idaho. Who are they? Where are they? And what is their zone of agreement? And by that I mean the principles and the objectives that these very diverse groups share that allow them to work together on projects. Then I'll go into restoration as a management paradigm for national forests. And this is going to be kind of the ecology interlude. We'll talk about what it means to have greater forest resilience to large-scale disturbance and what kinds of restoration actions we're thinking about in order to improve forest resilience. As part of that, I'll go into some of what it means potentially economically. But I'm not an economist, I'm a generalist. And so I'm not going to present to you a lot of slides about what this means economically. But when we get into this, you'll see that some of the direction that restoration would take us in would produce some significant economic benefits for those parts of Idaho that have a timber industry. If there's time at the end, I'll hit some policy issues. What's going on with the Forest Service? There's some new tools that they've been given. They're also facing a bunch of challenges, and I've got some recommendations to how the agency, how to help the agency accomplish more work in the national forests. Okay, so first about the Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership. This has been a really fun group to be part of. We formed in 2010 as a group of folks who were involved in the timber industry, environmental organizations, and the Society of American Foresters. Pretty diverse. And we looked at each other at a conference that SAF put together, Society of American Foresters, and we said, you know, there's something really interesting going on in Idaho, and actually across much of the West. People who have really different interests are beginning to sit down and talk about the future of national forests and actually work together to do some active management in parts of those forests, and they're finding some basis for agreement. We ought to get together an organization that tries to connect them, train them, provide them a common platform to communicate, and that supports their work. And that's what IFRP is. IFRP's main activity is to put on an annual conference that's kind of become the sort of the gathering of the tribe among forest restoration groups across Idaho. And it has been a fascinating forum that brings together everybody from the Wilderness Society to county commissioners to the big mill operators. So when we put together IFRP, we said, all right, what is our zone of agreement? What do we believe in collectively? And these were the key principles: that restoration is needed, that Idaho national forests and national forests across much of the West are not healthy. They need restoration. That active management is needed in places, not everywhere, but that's an important tool. That if we're going to get that active management on the ground, we need a healthy forest industry. We can't do it without the industry. The kinds of materials that need to come out of the woods as part of active restoration won't pay their way unless there's a market for them. And they won't ever come out unless there are people that have the professional expertise to get the job done. And the last one is the collaborative groups with diverse memberships are important to the success of the Forest Service accelerating the pay restoration. So this is a map of the collaborative groups active in Idaho. We'll talk about their attributes in a bit. They are all quite different from each other. All of them formed spontaneously in their community. There is no cookbook for what a collaborative group is. But all of these, to their own degree, include conservation interests, local government interests, timber industry interests, and often a pretty wide spectrum beyond that, from tribal to recreation, to community economic development. There's one missing. A new one has been formed just north of Haley there, in sort of the south central part of the state, that is called the 5B Coalition. It's dealing with the aftermath of the Beaver Creek burn from 2013. So some of these are big, complex collaboratives. Some of them are pretty small and working very locally. But together, they really amount to a very interesting pattern of work across the state. This is a subgroup of the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, taken a few years ago. These folks are looking a little older now. The guy with the pen is Bill Higgins. He's the manager of the Idaho Forest Group mill in Grangeville. Second on the right there is Don Ebert, Clearwater County Commissioner. The serious guy in the middle there with the hat and glasses, that's John McCarthy with the Wilderness Society. We've got a woman there from Elk City. I mean, it's a really interesting group. And what they're doing is they're going out in the field, figuring out what to do in that landscape to improve forest health and get logs to that mill. So I spoke earlier about the zone of agreement. What are the core principles that these groups share? You know, they're going to be diverse. They're going to be coming out the national forest from very different philosophies and perspectives and experience. So number one, they focus on restoring forest resilience in light of historic forest conditions. We'll go deep into this concept later, but the recognition that Idaho forests evolved with fire and insects and other kinds of disturbance, and that their ecology depends on disturbance. That if you understand that underlying ecology and how you can use active management as a type of disturbance that reinforces ecosystem health, that produces an important part of this zone of agreement. And applying that to the different forest types, and you know, the national forests in Idaho are tremendously diverse. There's pretty broad agreement on how you do restoration in dry forests. So these are your lower elevation, often ponderosa pine dominated forests, or a little more open. And the agreement tends to be that you go in there and thin the smaller trees, leaving the large, relatively fireproof trees in place. Also pretty broad agreement that we need to urgently do a lot of thinning in the wildland urban interface. This is where people are living up close to the forest. They tend to be our highest risk areas during big fires. There is emerging agreement on objectives for restoration in our other forest types. As you go further north in the state, the forests are wetter. As we'll talk in a little bit, their fire regimes naturally were a little bit more severe. And that idea of just thinning and leaving the big trees isn't as relevant in these forest types. So we'll talk a little bit about what forest restoration means in the Panhandle and Northern Clearwater forest. But for years, people couldn't agree on what forest restoration was in those forest types, and they're beginning to get there. More of the zoning agreement. The Idaho roadless rule really helps. I remember back in the 80s, environmentalists in the timber industry fought constantly over timber sales in roadless areas. And that was the big fight, punching roads in the roadless areas to get access to the timber. The roadless rule provides a framework for how those decisions get made. And really, because of their remoteness and because of the difficulty and expense of getting the trees out, most of this active restoration is going to be occurring in what we call the roaded front. So being able to agree on the part of the map where people focus their efforts on has really made a big difference. They agree that the forest products industry is essential to active restoration, and really the mills have changed in Idaho over the years so that they can accept a broader range of diameter of trees. Many of them can take a pretty small tree. So the mill capacity and the professional expertise of the forest products industry has evolved in ways that help us with forest restoration. And finally, they agree that forest restoration that focuses on thinning or logging or other kinds of vegetation treatment also should include efforts to improve water quality and wildlife habitat and other values. So often the revenue that is made by selling those wood products can be put back into the ground and do things like upgrade culverts, restore old problem roads, and do other things that help ecological values in the forest or recreation. So these groups face some challenges. They're diverse. Collaboration takes a lot of time and effort. Building trust with each other, building trust with the agency. Almost none of them have significant sources of funding. So they're often putting together small grants or volunteers to make their work happen. There's a long time lag in the Forest Service between when you plan an action and when you see it on the ground. And that can be particularly challenging for volunteers. They don't want to spend their fall planning a project and then wait 4 years to see it actually happen. But that is actually not at all uncommon. And some of this stuff's really tough. Not all issues are resolvable by consensus. Most of these groups work by consensus. And so what do they do when they hit a snag? And I'd actually say many of them have dealt with this pretty well. Where they've really gotten caught in disputes that hasn't ended the groups, they figured out how to overcome them. And the last thing is, ultimately, what you're doing is you're providing recommendations to an agency that has independent legal authorities and responsibilities, and it may not always accept them. So I'm going to pause here a little bit and invite questions from the group. If you want to keep track of what the forest collaboratives are doing, the Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership has a great website. There's its URL. Included in this is a page that I've got a screenshot here that is tracking the collaborative projects statewide. So if you want to know which timber sales, which restoration projects have been through a collaborative process, this is a great place to go.
I have a question, and you might get to this further down, but how can communities or economic development organizations or local governments help facilitate these restoration efforts with Idaho Forest Partners or I guess, how do they reach out and work with them to kind of?
Let's go back up to the map. Because there's actually been really interesting stuff going on between economic development and local governments in these collaboratives. So local governments are participating in a big way on the Payette Forest Coalition, the Clearwater Basin Coalition. Shoshone County, I think, is local government led. Panhandle Collaborative has some local government, and Kootenai Valley Resource Initiative is actually 3 government entities working together. It's the Boundary County, City of Bonners Ferry, and the Kootenai Tribe. So local government is critical as a player on these groups. Economic development entities have also been pretty active. In the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, they actually have an economic development subcommittee. I'll mention it briefly later. And so sometimes we've had like the RC&Ds as the fiscal agent for managing some of these funds. And I think that a lot of these groups need strong players who are good at collaboration, creative thinking, and working with others. You know, and I think that's a good skill set for folks who are doing that kind of work. And again, you're going to that zone of agreement where if you can figure out how to get a big restoration project on the ground, the logs will flow. We'll talk about one of those projects later in the presentation. So go to the webpage, take a look. If you're a Facebook person, Idaho Forest Restoration Partnership's got a great Facebook presence because what it does is it shares articles, really interesting articles on forest restoration. It's a great place to kind of keep track about what's going on with national forest policy and management. All right, so we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit more, going back to this question, why would a conservation group favor more logging? And I'm going to try to go slow because this is going to go pretty deep in some of the ecology, but it's super interesting stuff. So what does restoration mean as a management paradigm? What does it mean ecologically, and what would it mean in terms of managing our forests? And there are 2 types of restoration right there. Where, how much, what kinds of forest management would restoration support? So I threw this picture in there because I always want to point out that for those of us who are environmentalists, we struggle with this. When you say logging on national forests, this is what we're going to think about, right? Big, steep, clear cuts, lots of rows. It's like, but that's not the reality. I don't think this is national forest ground to begin with anyway. But how we get the conservation community over their attitude towards what logging means and to think about it as a tool involves getting people out there on the ground and looking at the landscape, figuring out how they want to move what they see so that its health is improved. And as I mentioned earlier, a key to the understanding is that pretty much all of Idaho's forests are fire adapted. If you remove fire or other types of disturbance from these forests, they change in ways that can be really problematic. This is a dry forest. It looks like it's after a restoration treatment. Somebody's doing a prescribed burn underneath ponderosa pine. Nice ground fire. That's not. That looks to me like subalpine fir. That's a really severe fire. And in subalpine fir, that kind of fire is not unusual. That's actually kind of could be part of a natural fire regime. So this is a map of Idaho that shows the different historic fire regimes. So when I say they adapted to fire, this is our estimate of what that fire, the different classes of fire that would have been applied across the ground under natural conditions. What you see here is that when you start at the lowest and driest sites, you get that low severity fire, that fire that might have looked like that. You go to the highest elevations in that purple, and you get a pretty high severity fire. Naturally, those higher elevation forests tended to burn in what you call a stand replacing fire, in groups, crown runs, more severe fire. And in between is sort of a mixed severity fire. When you look at Idaho, understanding what kind of natural fire regime these forests were adapted to becomes a really critical part in thinking about what role restoration will play. So how things changed and why. These folks were tremendously effective after World War II. Smoke jumpers, fire suppression, we got good at putting out fires, and we did it for decades. And that significantly changed the composition of Idaho forests. They went from forests that were regularly seeing disturbance that would create openings and mixed patches of burned and live trees at a diverse matrix of tree stands, ages, and openings across large landscapes. Across a lot of Idaho now, it looks more like this. Pretty uniform. So my friend Orville Daniels put together some shots. This is in the upper Clearwater Basin. Keeping in mind that the Clearwater Basin through the 1910 period and into the 20s and 30s had a series of very large fires. But these are 3 shots, different years. I guess we're not seeing the year on the bottom one. The bottom photos are present. This is 1952, 72. You can see this dramatic change from a post-fire environment filling in, and today it's just a closed canopy of trees. Bad luck, same story. Running Creek, Upper Selway Country, same story. So we are now dealing with the ecological consequences of that bottom shot. Now these are snapshots. Everywhere is different, right? But this is a very common pattern that we've seen this transition in our forests. So the fuels and the forest health are going to be very different between the condition under which these forests evolved and the way it is today. And you add to that a big driver of climate change. Fire seasons are longer and hotter than they were, up to 70 days. And the way I think about it is that weather dominates fire behavior and fuels matter. And when you have weather interacting with fuels, you can get some really severe type fires. I'll go back to this, like this. I think this is a pioneer fire from last year. And the term that the ecologists use for these fires that are interacting under conditions that are not what the forests evolved with, is they call it uncharacteristic fire. So these fires will replace the forests altogether. You'll actually see a net decrease in forested area. It'll go back to brush or grasslands. You'll see hydrologic consequences when entire watersheds burn and you can't sustain the fisheries or the hydrologic functions. The values that we want from the national forests are lost or degraded. I don't think you have to know much about Idaho or have driven around much, but I've seen this stuff. It is amazing how fast big mega fires have burned in Idaho. So this is not just Idaho. This is the national trend of increasing fire. That's Idaho. This is the burn perimeters in Idaho since 1984. When the drought came in the late 80s, we really saw a shift in the size of fire. For those of us around in Boise, the Loman burn in 1989 was 40,000 acres, and we thought it was huge.
I remember that.
You know, you get this cursor. This is the Mustang Complex. This is 300,000 acres in 2012. So we've now seen 180,000 acre fires in the Pioneer, on the Rabbit Creek burn, the Blackwell and Corral Complex up here north of McCall. If you started here, you know, New Meadows or McCall, and you decided you want to go across the state to Salmon, you are almost continuously inside a fire perimeter of the last 30 plus years. This, by the way, also includes range fires down in range country and sage grouse habitat. Very different story, but also very problematic. So fire is coming back. Not all of these burn perimeters represent uncharacteristic fire. The outcomes are very different from place to place, but we're seeing more and more large fires, climate-driven, fuel-driven fires that are uncharacteristic and damaging. You'll also see that North Idaho hasn't seen the return of the fire. And if you remember back to our fire regime map, that's the cooler, moisture forest where it's naturally more severe. So the question for North Idaho is, as those forests grow thicker with less openings, will the fire, when it does come back, be all the more catastrophic as a result? So that's my uncharacteristic photo. That's what it looks like. Trees that would normally survive periodic fire in these areas go up in a torch. Even the big fire resilient trees are lost, and what you wind up with is an ecosystem that's pretty bad damaged. So if that's the statement of the problem, what do we do about it? How do we think about it? Where do we go? Why do we go? This is the way the Nature Conservancy thinks about it. We've got some scientists who've been grappling with this pretty hard. And this is a complicated chart, so look at it kind of carefully, and we'll spend some time with it. Down across the bottom are a set of forest stands, vegetation conditions that you'd find out in this landscape. This is Northern Rockies dry mixed conifers. So this is going to be those drier forests. The Northern Rockies ecoregion in Idaho is basically from the Waxhaw River down to the Snake River Plain. So from the forest edge up to that Waxhaw River is basically an extension of Clearwater. So the boxes with the dashed line are our best estimate of what these forest types were like originally. So on the y-axis, you have a distribution. How much of the landscape was composed of these different forest types? So you'll see, for instance, in this exercise, about 10% of these forests were originally essentially open in an early successional stage. A lot of the forest, what 35%, was in what they call a late open, which is a relatively open forest but with mature trees. And those trees will have thick bark. They'll be pretty fireproof. When a ground burn goes through, there's not a lot of fuel to take the fire from the ground up into the crowns of the trees. The bars are what they are. So what's that mean? We've got some situations where we've got a lot more of some of those classes than we used to, and some situations where we've got a lot less. What's the theme? The theme is that we've gone a lot to late closed environments. The late open has been lost, and we've filled it in, and in that late closed environment, you've got those shorter trees that will carry fire into the crowns. You'll have a big uncharacteristic fire as a result. You've got a little less of the openings, and you've got a lot less of that late open. So in thinking about what the purpose of restoration is across a landscape, we think about how you would move these landscapes back closer to their historic condition. And I want to pause there for a second because there's an important point to make, and that is that the assumption, and it's a good assumption, is that historically the condition would have been fire adapted. The forest would have been resilient to disturbance and able to recover from it under their historic condition. But we're not going to get back there. The climate has changed. We've got invasive species. We've got various ways in which these landscapes have evolved. So increasingly, the restoration ecologists are thinking about how to make forests resilient to a future range of variability. And they grapple hard because we can always look back in time to figure out what the forests look like once. Figuring out what they need to look like now to adapt to a future is tougher. But the basic idea is that we want to try to get greater diversity into these forests and to make them more like historic ranges. So in thinking about that, there's two kinds of active management that we can do to accomplish that result. One is just disturbance only. We go in, we reduce the canopy cover or the tree density. It sort of knocks the forest back to an earlier successional stage, more representative of its historic distribution. It can be done by fire or mechanical treatment. I'll say this, in many parts of the eroded front country, you can't reintroduce fire. These systems are too crowded. The fire becomes too severe. You're too close to towns. and you're too close to valuable timber resources. So our assumption is that in many parts of the eroded front country, the only way you go at this is by doing mechanical first to thin and then getting prescribed fire. And that's not a once through proposition. You need to be able to keep doing that over time so that you sustain a forest. In other parts, you do the mechanical treatment and then you let it grow. There's large parts, remember that fire history map, there are large parts of Idaho forest that now simply need to be left for succession. They need to be allowed to grow back. So restoration includes disturbance through active management or through fire, but also in many places, leave it alone, got to recover. So what does that mean on a landscape scale? And here we get into some interesting thoughts for what this might mean for communities. What if we take these principles and try to apply them in a landscape? So there was some work done by the Nature Conservancy for the Clearwater Basin Collaborative that gives us an insight for what a restoration program would look like in that forest. So it's the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, about 4 million acres. Of that, I'm going to say about 1.2 million acres is the eroded front country. There's a lot of wilderness and roadless areas in there. You see the Selway Bitterroot there and kind of up against the Montana border. So in that 1.2 million acres of front country, what kind of restoration results might we see? So this is the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, again, a few years ago, a big bunch of folks. Yeah, let's see here if I get this cursor. This is Alex Irby, formerly a comparable timber. He's a co-chair. Timber industry guy. This guy over here, Dale Harris, with the Great Burn Study Group. He's an environmentalist from Montana. They have sued each other. So they're now working together. This guy's from the Forest Service in DC. He is the head of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program that is providing some agency funding to this huge group of people that is working to do forest restoration and community development in the Clearwater country. There's our friend Skip Brandt, Idaho County Commissioner. Mitch Silvers with Senator Crapo's office. Senator Crapo convened this collaborative. Any really super interesting and diverse group of folks. Oh, there's my colleague. Where did my cursor go? There's Robin Miller of the Nature Conservancy. She represents us on this group. So there are the components of the Clearwater Basin Collaborative. The Wilderness Society guy talking to the off-road vehicle guy. Dave Allen-Tuamini is the motorized recreationist, and they're talking about things like wilderness proposals and boundaries. Clearwater Basin Collaborative is doing things like there's a Gem State Trail proposal the group has been seeking grant funding for and broken ground on. So there's recreation part of it. They've got a wildlife initiative trying to get some better elk habitat. There's some burning and working with Fish and Game. They even have a Clearwater Basin Youth Conservation Corps where they're taking kids, including that goofy guy on the right, into the woods to teach them skills that are necessary to have to be able to work in the timber industry. So the Nature Conservancy's analysis looked at the habitat types across the Clearwater Basin. And this is sort of an estimate of a modeled estimate of the historic forest composition of Clearwater. Pretty diverse. It tended to be drier in the south, wetter in the north. And for each of those, we came up with a range of stands that would be representative of that ecosystem habitat type. And then we looked at what there was today and calculated where you would need to disturb it in order to create more openings or less dense forest. That's our conclusion. That 61% of the coniferous forests in the basin are moderate to severely departed from their historic conditions. And those 61% are pretty different from what they were historically. And that's what it looks like. The red represents disturbance restoration need. Not surprisingly, down in that drier, more fire-prone southern part, it's redder. The moister stuff that had the longer intervals between fires is a little less red, but there, the restoration need may not be stand structure and fire. There, the restoration need may be to bring in bring back white pine. White pine has been lost in a lot of these forests due to blister rust. There's an opportunity to bring this is the Idaho state tree.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Back into this system. White pine were very resilient, really a backbone of these forested ecosystems. And so restoration might be a different kind up and further north in the Clearwater. And where you want it to grow back. With the fires that are burning all the time, I suspect our growing back is going to increase. I mean, there's big fires burning today up in the Selway country. So the Clearwater Basin Collaborative's agreement and work plan is, okay, we're going to use active management in the eroded front to meet ecological and economic objectives for mechanical treatment of prescribed fire. What does that look like? I hate to throw a chart in front of you, but this is an interesting one. The top line of numbers is the Nez Perce Clearwater suitable timber base. 4 million acre forest, 1.2 million acres is the eroded front, 724,000 acres is the suitable timber base. So the timber industry in the Clearwater Basin will depend on its federal supply of logs on 724,000 acres out of a 4 million acre forest. That's what's going to have to sustain that part of the timber industry. When we look at that portion of the forest, roughly half of it needs disturbance-based restoration. And that is a lot of activity. In many of those forests, what's happened is what the foresters refer to as the mid-cirral bulge, which is not the middle age bulge. It is the forest equivalent of the middle age bulge. Its trees are about 80 to 100 years old that have survived because of fire suppression. And so this isn't thinning little stuff between big ponderosas. This is thinning large logs in very dense stands of middle-aged trees. So it's a lot of wood. If you did restoration in the eroded front country of the Clearwater, Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, you would need, we think, to more than double the current amount of logging. Probably significantly more than that. We haven't come up with the real numbers. We active the envelope, and it's a lot. Getting that amount of work done would be very challenging. So there it is, 353,000. And then in these others, there might be some harvest. There's a lot of the forest there that 982,000 acres, which is not suitable with no harvest, is going to be in roadless areas where that's not permitted, or in wilderness areas, and that's going to have to be done by fire. And that's what it looks like in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. So this is, if I recall right, this was one of the original round of wildernesses established after the Wilderness Act in '64. So it's an old wilderness, and it's been managed for natural fire for quite a while. And those fires are all going to be different from each other. Some of them are going to be uncharacteristic, undoubtedly. But what's interesting about this wilderness area is that you see a lot of smaller fires. That's now a much more diverse landscape, and you won't tend to get those huge, multi-100,000 acre fires sweeping through this because of the diversity of the fire history since the 1970s. So fire is going to be an important tool in places where it is socially acceptable to burn. I'm going to switch down now. It's going to be south of the Salmon. We're going to go into the Payette National Forest and just take a quick look at a particular project. This is the Payette Forest Collaborative. It's one of the collaboratives in Idaho that is funded through the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project, or program. This is, again, Forest Service funding to help collaboratives get projects on the ground. This is the area that the collaborative has been working in, is sort of the western part of the Payette Forest and some of their different projects. I'm going to give you a slide on this one right here. This is the Lost Creek Boulder Creek project. So the next slide will be that landscape. It's just west of New Meadows. So they came in on the Lost Creek Boulder Creek, and in about 18 months did a full environmental impact statement. That's the full National Environmental Policy Act document. on 80,000 plus acres and came up with the vegetation treatments that they expect to use in order to make this forest more resilient. And you can see how they've sort of, what I like about it is they're looking at a big landscape and thinking about what it needs to look like after treatment. Not looking at, not looking through the wrong end of the binoculars at some little tiny spot on the forest. They're looking at a big landscape and saying, we need to see a matrix of different types of forest stands in this large area of forest in order to increase its resilience. So you can see there what's involved. It's a lot of work. It'll take years and years. In terms of the Payette forest, this is a big project. 30 to 70 million board feet for the Payette is big. We'd like to see a lot more of this kind of thing, but this is the largest project they've had in quite a while. Hats off to the Payette Forest National Forest staff and for the collaborative for helping them pull this off. It got challenged in court. The collaborative intervened, which meant that they came into the court proceeding as a full party to defend the project. And Judge Edward Lodge issued an order denying the first motion for an injunction by the plaintiff. And I went ahead and gave you this quote out of his decision. I think it's interesting. He says that when you consider an injunction, you consider what's in the public interest. And moving forest conditions back closer to the historic condition to make them more resilient and acting upon the recommendations of the collaborative are factors the court weighed in considering what the public interest was and in denying this motion for an injunction. The case was later dismissed. It's now on appeal, but the project is moving forward. So I'm looking at the little box with questions, and nobody's asked one yet, so feel free, you can go back anywhere. I'm going to shift gears and talk a little bit about policy, because I think that the idea of the zone of agreement is beginning to get more traction in DC and within the agency. And so we've seen some interesting developments in the last couple of years for some new tools to try to accelerate that kind of forest restoration. And the first big one is beginning to play out in Idaho is the insect and disease priority areas that was adopted in 2014 under the Farm Bill. And this allows the governors in the western states and the Forest Service to designate areas that are at particular risk from insect and disease and have a process for streamlining the environmental reviews. Under the federal law, it's a process called a categorical exclusion. You can go very quickly through from design of the project to its implementation without a full environmental impact statement. You need to do some environmental review, and under this authority, you need to be collaborative. So you need to engage the public in designing the project. And the maximum size of the project is 3,000 acres. It was great. Forest Service got a new tool that's beginning to roll out in several places around the state. Another one that's come along is the Good Neighbor Authority, also out of the Farm Bill. This one actually has been, I think, one of the most promising developments. The Good Neighbor Authority gives the Forest Service the ability to work with the State Department of Lands and have, in our case, Idaho Department of Lands, IDL, help implement forest management actions on federal land. And so what they do is the feds still do the environmental review and they still make the decision, but the contracting, the sale layout, the administration of the sale, the managing of the funds of the sale can all be done by IDL. And it's no surprise that IDL can be a bit more efficient than the federal agencies. So it's an important way of extending the capacity of the Forest Service to get projects on the ground. The timber industry, the state legislature, and the Forest Service all put money into a pot under the Idaho Good Neighbor Authority. And IDL is now beginning to do the first round of projects, actually one of them inside of the Lost Creek, Boulder Creek area, using this authority. So we're pretty excited that we're getting some synergy between the state and the federal agencies. The revenues from these projects can be used for restoration, but they can also be used, obviously, to pay IDL back for its time. There's also a new process that got rid of the old Forest Service appeals process. It's an objection process, much more streamlined approach within the agency for resolving environmental disputes. And then the agency itself has come up with regional strike teams. One of the critical things is to overcome the agency's own internal inertia about getting projects on the ground. And so the idea of these regional strike teams that come in, work hard on a big project, get it on the ground or get it ready into the pipeline and then move on to another area, looks to us like a pretty effective tool. So there's some progress. I would say that very few of the folks involved with the forest collaboratives feel like the level of activity on forest restoration has reached an adequate level. I think we almost all want to see it accelerate significantly. So in terms of thinking about the recommendations we'd have, going back to Congress, when you think about forest management, support collaboration and think about the zone of agreement. Right now you have the ability to focus agency actions on things that are broadly supported. The timber wars are for the most part over, or at least many of the combatants of the timber wars have switched sides and are now working together. Fund the collaborative forest landscape restoration program and pay attention to things like hazardous fuels reductions. We fight every year about how much that is, and it can be pretty scary. We've seen some proposals for some big cuts in hazardous fuel reduction. Sustain the agency's land management budget, reform funding of wildfire, and improve implementation on the ground through projects. So I have one last little piece to talk about, and that is a particular proposal pending in Congress. It's actually a super interesting issue. Mike Crapo is the lead Senate sponsor of the Wildfire Disaster Funding Act in the Senate, and Mike Simpson is the lead sponsor of the same act in the House. Our delegation has been very interested in figuring out how to shift some of the cost of wildfire suppression out of the agency budget and into disaster funding. Why does that make sense? Because this is what's happening to the agency's budget. In 1995, fire suppression was about 16% of the Forest Service budget. Today, it's over half. In 10 years, it's going to be 2/3. So we are seeing a continuing erosion of the agency's ability to manage the land. So this is a diagram that shows the staffing levels for the green shirts, which are everything other than fire suppression. It's sort of the National Forest System lands capacity. So everything from recreation to planting timber sales. Yellow shirts, fire suppression. We've seen a 39% decrease in Forest Service non-fire personnel so far this century. And I think there are all kinds of ways the agency can do more with less, but in the end, you're going to need to fund these folks so that they can get this work done. The Wildfire Disaster Funding Act would take 30%, how to put this? The way Congress is funding wildfire now is that they take the past 10-year average of suppression cost and they bake that into the agency budget. So they budget to the 10-year average. Why is that not working? Because that average is going up very steeply. Costs are escalating incredibly steeply. We hardly ever are below that 10-year average. Part of it is that people have moved into the forest. Part of it is that they've been having more and more hot, dry summers and long fire seasons. And people demand fire protection, so it's expensive. So about 2% of the fires amount to 30% of the cost to the agency. In other words, it's the 2% biggest fires that are producing a lot of the overruns. When the agency goes over that 10-year average, it has to pirate money from other programs in order to backfill the suppression need, and has been very disruptive to agency function. So Wildfire Disaster Funding Act would take that 30%, where you exceed the 10-year average, up to 30% of the cost would come out of disaster funding, reflecting the idea that wildfires at that scale are like other natural disasters and should be funded that way. So, some take-home lessons. We think the collaborators are providing critical support for action. That zone of agreement is holding, and making good things happen on the local level. We need to be realistic. Those 9 groups that I had up there are all acting in local areas. Their lasting value is not necessarily that they're going to have collaboration on every forest restoration project that goes forward in Idaho. Their lasting value, I suspect, is that they will develop the templates that represent the kind of action that is broadly supported by conservation groups, by local communities, and meets timber industry needs. And that those kind of projects can be implemented quickly by an agency that feels like it has the backing of the public for action. And with that, thank you.
Thank you. That was incredibly informative. I don't see any questions. Must have been.
We'll pause.
Yeah. Anybody has any?
Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate your participating. And Amanda has my contacts. If you have any questions or want to follow up with me, she can get a hold of me.
I do. And just so you know, all of these are recorded. So if you want to, oh, we have a question. Oh, just thank you. You're welcome, Tina. Yeah.
Thanks, Tina.
Got very excited. So if you would like to view this again or share it with anybody in your communities or businesses you work with, please don't hesitate to get a hold of me, Amanda Ames here at Commerce, or anyone here at Commerce actually should be able to point you in the right direction. So with that, thank you again, and we will be back next month with a full agenda.